Stale champagne smells like bruised fruit when it dries on cold marble. Billionaires throw their lavish parties, wreck the room, and vanish into the night, leaving the invisible working class to scrape crushed caviar out of imported silk rugs. Rowan just wanted to finish his 3 a.m. cleaning shift in peace. He didn't expect his bargain bin suppressants to finally give out. And he certainly didn't expect the Billionaire host, lingering in the shadows, to finally recognize the scent he had completely ignored all evening. Industrial-grade ammonia burned the inside of Rowan's nostrils, a sharp chemical sting that he welcomed. It overpowered the cloying, suffocating stench of the ballroom. 300 alphas and omegas from the city's upper crust had spent the last 8 hours sweating out top-shelf liquor, exhaling expensive cigars, and leaking subtle, perfectly curated pheromones into the climate-controlled air. Now, the room just smelled like a locker room doused in expensive perfume. Rowan dragged the heavy, yellow mop bucket across the floor. The plastic wheels squeaked, a high, rhythmic complaint that echoed off the vaulted ceilings. He plunged the mop into the gray water, the muscles in his forearms bunching. His knuckles were cracked, bleeding slightly at the joints where the dry winter air and harsh detergents had eaten away the skin. He didn't wear gloves. The cheap latex ones the contracting company provided always made his hands sweat and tore within the first 10 minutes anyway. He wrung the mop out with a harsh yank of the lever. Water splattered onto the toe of his steel-toed work boot. He sighed, a jagged sound in the empty space, and began pushing the wet cotton over a sticky puddle of what looked like a spilled Cosmopolitan. His lower back throbbed with a dull, persistent ache. It was a familiar pain, one that he usually pushed down with ibuprofen and sheer stubbornness, but tonight it felt different. He paused, leaning his weight against the fiberglass handle of the mop, and pressed the heel of his hand against his lower spine. A sudden flush of heat crawled up the back of his neck. Rowan closed his eyes. "Not tonight," he muttered, the words raspy. "Don't do this tonight." He had taken his pills before his shift. Generic brand. The kind you bought from the dingy pharmacy on 4th Street where the pharmacist didn't ask to see a prescription. They tasted like chalk and usually left him with a splitting migraine, but they kept his biology in check. Usually. He took a deep breath, trying to steady the sudden, rapid thumping in his chest. His own scent, something he meticulously kept buried under layers of deodorant and artificial blockers, flickered. It wasn't the sweet bakery-fresh scent that rich Omegas spent thousands trying to amplify. Rowan smelled like damp asphalt after a summer rainstorm, cut with a sharp, bitter edge of crushed rosemary. It was an unrefined, working-class scent. High above the ballroom floor, in the shadowed alcove of the mezzanine, Calvin sat in a leather armchair that cost more than Rowan's life insurance policy. Calvin wasn't looking at the cleaner. He wasn't looking at anything. He held a heavy crystal tumbler of scotch. The ice long melted, watering down the amber liquid. His tie was pulled loose, the top 2 buttons of his tailored dress shirt undone. He had a headache that pulsed right behind his left eye. The party had been a success, by all financial metrics. Mergers had been discussed. Hands had been shaken. He had smiled until his jaw ached, playing the perfect commanding alpha host. He was exhausted. Not the physical exhaustion of labor, but a deep, hollow fatigue in his bones, the kind that came from being surrounded by people who only saw him as a walking bank account or a stepping stone. Calvin raised the glass to his lips but stopped before the liquor touched his tongue. A scent hit him. It was faint at first, barely a whisper cutting through the stale miasma of the ballroom. It didn't belong here. It wasn't synthetic lotus flower or engineered sandalwood. It was raw. Gritty. It smelled like rain hitting a hot sidewalk. It bypassed the logical, highly educated part of Calvin's brain and struck directly at the base of his spine. His eyes snapped open. The heavy, lethargic fog of the scotch vanished. His alpha instincts, usually so tightly leashed under layers of corporate discipline, surged forward with a violent, possessive snap. He set the glass down on the side table. The crystal clinked sharply against the wood. Calvin stood up, his gaze sweeping the cavernous room below. The chandeliers were dimmed to a low amber glow, casting long shadows across the debris. For a moment, he saw nothing. Then, movement caught his eye near the grand staircase. A man in a baggy, stained gray jumpsuit was aggressively scrubbing a section of the marble floor. Calvin stepped to the edge of the glass railing, his hands gripping the cool metal. The scent was stronger now. It was definitely coming from the cleaner. Calvin flared his nostrils, drawing it in. It was defensive, spiked with irritation and physical pain. The Omega down there was hurting, and his failing suppressants were broadcasting it to the empty room. And then, a memory slammed into Calvin with the force of a physical blow. 4 hours ago. The party had been at its peak. Calvin had been cornered near the ice sculpture by a particularly aggressive investor who was talking too loud and standing too close. Calvin had been tense, his own dominant pheromones leaking out in an unconscious display of dominance to push the other man back. In his irritation, Calvin had stepped backward and collided with someone. A tray of empty champagne flutes had shattered. Glass exploded across the floor. Calvin had turned, annoyed. He remembered a blur of gray fabric, a worker already dropping to his knees to gather the broken glass with bare hands. Calvin hadn't looked at his face. He hadn't bothered. To Calvin, the staff were just fixtures of the room, invisible machinery meant to keep the gears turning. He had pulled a crumpled $100 bill from his pocket, tossed it onto the tray, muttered a clipped, dismissive apology to the top of the worker's head, and walked away without waiting for a response. He had ignored him. He had dropped money on him like he was a broken vending machine. Calvin stared down at the man with the mop. The gray jumpsuit was the same. The realization tasted like bile in the back of Calvin's throat. He had been standing inches away from his biological match. The pull of the scent right now was undeniable. It was the kind of deep-rooted compatibility that alphas spent their entire lives searching for in pristine, high-society matchmaking clinics. And Calvin had bumped into him, thrown money at him, and walked away because the man was wearing a uniform. A wave of profound, sickening self-disgust washed over Calvin. He stepped away from the railing and headed for the stairs. His footsteps, heavy in custom leather shoes, sounded like gunshots in the quiet hall. Down on the floor, Rowan heard the approaching steps. He didn't look up immediately. He just kept his head down, working the mop over a particularly stubborn smudge of chocolate. Rich people, he thought bitterly, could never just eat their food. They had to smear it everywhere. The footsteps stopped about 10 feet away. Rowan wrung out the mop again, the squeak echoing loudly. He dragged the back of his forearm across his forehead, wiping away a layer of cold sweat. His hands were shaking. The heat was pooling in his lower abdomen now, a heavy dragging sensation that made him want to curl up on the cold floor and sleep for a week. "The hall is closed, sir," Rowan said. His voice was gravelly, rough from hours of silence. He still didn't look up. "If you left a coat, check with the security desk in the lobby. I own the building." The voice was deep, resonant, and carried a subtle, unconscious undercurrent of alpha command. It wasn't an arrogant statement. It was just a fact, stated plainly. Rowan froze. The mop handle slipped slightly in his sweaty grip. He recognized that voice. It belonged to the guy who had nearly knocked him over earlier, the guy who had thrown a crumpled bill at him as if paying for the privilege of being reckless. Slowly, Rowan turned his head. Calvin stood there, a few yards away. The man looked like a magazine cover that had been left out in the rain. His dark hair was slightly messy, falling over his forehead. He had shed his suit jacket, and his white shirt clung to the broad span of his shoulders. But it was his eyes that made Rowan's breath hitch. They were dark, fixed on Rowan with an intensity that felt almost physical. And the smell. Calvin wasn't masking his scent anymore. The rich, heavy aroma of aged oak and dark tobacco rolled across the space between them. It hit Rowan's failing suppressants like a match dropped in dry brush. Rowan's knees buckled slightly. He caught himself, gripping the mop handle so tightly his knuckles turned white. Anger, hot and sudden, flared in Rowan's chest. It cut through the biological haze, sharp and clarifying. He hated that smell. He hated what it was doing to his body. Congratulations, Rowan said flatly, turning back to his bucket. I'll make sure to scrub extra hard for the landlord. Calvin flinched. The hostility in the Omega's voice was palpable. It wasn't the simpering, accommodating tone he was used to hearing. It was raw disdain. You're in pain, Calvin said, taking a step forward. I'm working, Rowan snapped, aggressively shoving the mop across the floor. Back off. You're standing in the wet spot. Calvin stopped. He looked down at his shoes, then back up at Rowan. The man was practically vibrating with tension. His pale neck was flushed a deep, unhealthy red, and his chest heaved with uneven breaths. Your suppressants are failing, Calvin said, his voice dropping an octave, slipping involuntarily into a protective rumble. You shouldn't be working. You need a safe room. I need to finish my zone so I can clock out and get paid, Rowan interrupted, finally turning to face Calvin fully. His eyes were dark, fierce, and completely devoid of fear. What I don't need is a billionaire playing doctor at 3 a.m, so unless you're going to grab a sponge and help me get the vomit out of the ficus planter over there, leave me alone. Silence stretched between them, thick and heavy. Calvin was stunned. Alphas in his circle were treated with deference. An alpha of his wealth and status was treated like royalty. No one spoke to him like this. Certainly not an Omega in the early stages of a heat drop. Biologically, Rowan should be seeking comfort, seeking a nest, instinctively deferring to the nearest strong alpha presence. Instead, Rowan looked ready to hit him with the mop. I threw money at you earlier, Calvin said. The words tasted like ash. He hadn't meant to say it, but the guilt was clawing at his throat. Rowan let out a short, humorless laugh. He reached into the deep pocket of his jumpsuit, pulled out the crumpled $100 bill, and tossed it onto the marble floor between them. It landed softly, a pathetic little piece of paper in the grand expanse of the room. Yeah, you did, Rowan said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. Keep it. I get paid by the hour, not by the insult. Calvin stared at the bill. He felt a sudden, intense urge to drop to his knees and apologize, an instinct that deeply unsettled him. His alpha biology was screaming at him to fix this, to soothe the angry Omega, to provide. But his rational mind was completely out of its depth. He didn't know how to talk to a man who didn't want anything from him. I didn't look at you, Calvin admitted, stepping over the money, moving closer. I was distracted. I was rude. I'm sorry. Great. Apology accepted. Now move. Rowan tried to step past him to reach a discarded napkin, but Calvin shifted, blocking his path. You're shaking, Calvin said quietly. It's cold in here, Rowan lied. A drop of sweat rolled down his temple. The rosemary and damp earth scent was spiking, flooding the air, a chaotic distress signal that Rowan's body was sending out even as his mind fought it. Calvin reached out, slowly, deliberately. He didn't want to spook the man, but he couldn't stop himself. His large hand hovered in the air, then gently grasped Rowan's wrist. Rowan gasped, a sharp intake of breath. The point of contact burned. The heat of Calvin's skin seeped through the thin fabric of the jumpsuit sleeve, sending a jolt of electricity straight up Rowan's arm. It felt terrifyingly good. It felt like an anchor in the middle of a raging storm. Rowan violently yanked his arm back. Don't touch me, Rowan snarled, stumbling backward. His heel caught the edge of the mop bucket. The heavy plastic tipped. Gray, filthy water sloshed over the side, flooding the marble floor they had both been standing on, soaking into Calvin's expensive leather shoes and the cuffs of his trousers. Rowan froze, staring at the spreading puddle. A brief flicker of panic crossed his face. That was a write-up. That was a deduction in pay. He had just ruined a rich man's clothes. The defiance drained out of him for a split second, replaced by the bone-deep conditioned fear of the working poor who had just damaged something they couldn't afford to replace. Calvin didn't even look at his ruined shoes. He kept his eyes locked on Rowan. He saw the panic. He saw the way Rowan's shoulders suddenly slumped, the exhaustion finally catching up to the adrenaline. Leave the bucket, Calvin said softly. I have to clean it up. It's a slip hazard. My supervisor... Rowan babbled, dropping to his knees, his hands hovering over the dirty water, unsure of how to scoop it back up. His movements were jerky, uncoordinated. The heat was crashing over him now, blurring his vision. Calvin dropped to his knees right into the filthy puddle. The dirty water soaked instantly into his bespoke trousers. Rowan stared at him, bewildered. What are you doing? Get up. I'm not leaving you here like this, Calvin said, his voice a steady, immovable force. He didn't try to touch Rowan again. He just sat there, in the muck, ruining a suit that cost more than Rowan made in a year, offering his presence as a shield rather than a cage. I'm not going to touch you. I'm not going to force you, but I am not walking away. Rowan looked at the billionaire, sitting in the spilled mop water. Calvin's dark eyes were entirely sincere, stripped of the corporate arrogance. The dark tobacco scent had shifted, losing its dominant edge, softening into something warm, grounding, and fiercely protective. Rowan's chest heaved. He wanted to yell. He wanted to tell the man to go to hell, but his back felt like it was breaking, his head was spinning, and the warmth radiating from Calvin was the only thing in the freezing, massive room that felt real. A ragged sob tore itself from Rowan's throat, a sound of pure frustration and biological defeat. He squeezed his eyes shut, his dirty, cracked hands trembling violently as he wrapped his arms around his own torso. I just wanted to finish my shift, Rowan whispered brokenly. I know, Calvin said gently. I know. Calvin's knees soaked up the freezing, chemical-laced water. It seeped through the fine wool of his trousers, chilling him to the bone, but he didn't move. He watched Rowan shudder, the man's pride finally fracturing under the crush of a chemically induced heat. We need to get you out of here, Calvin said quietly. Rowan shook his head, a jerky, panicked motion. He was still staring at the overturned bucket. My supervisor, they dock pay for left messes. It's in the contract. The sheer absurdity of the statement hit Calvin like a physical blow. This man's biology was tearing him apart, his body preparing for a grueling, feverish cycle that demanded safety and isolation, and he was worried about a corporate write-up. It was a stark, ugly look into a world Calvin owned but never actually saw. I will handle your supervisor, Calvin said. He kept his hands flat on his thighs, making sure he wasn't looming. I'll buy the damn contracting company tomorrow if I have to. The mess doesn't matter. Rowan let out a wet, breathless sound that might have been a laugh. Sure, buy the company. Fix it with money. Always works. He tried to stand. His steel-toed boots slipped on the wet marble. His knees buckled immediately. Calvin reacted without thinking. He surged upward, catching Rowan by the elbows before he could hit the floor. The contact was electric. Rowan felt like a furnace, his skin radiating a dry, intense heat through the damp sleeves of his jumpsuit. The scent of crushed rosemary and wet pavement exploded upward, so thick Calvin could practically taste it. His own alpha instincts flared, a heavy, possessive growl vibrating in the back of his throat. He ruthlessly swallowed it down. This wasn't a mating chase. This was a medical crisis. Rowan stiffened at the growl, his eyes widening. Panic, sharp and metallic, spiked in his scent. I've got you, Calvin said, keeping his voice dead level, fighting his own biology. I am just holding you up. Which way is the service elevator? Rowan swallowed hard, his throat clicking. Down the hall, past the kitchens. Calvin practically carried him. He threw one of Rowan's arms over his shoulder, taking the brunt of the man's weight. Rowan's breathing was shallow and fast, hot puffs of air hitting Calvin's neck. They hobbled past the debris of the party, crushed orchids, empty catering trays, spilled wine that looked like dried blood in the dim light. The service hallway was starkly different from the ballroom. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a harsh, unforgiving glare on the scuffed linoleum and cinder-block walls. It smelled of industrial degreaser and old garbage. It was the backstage of Calvin's empire, and it looked bleak. Rowan leaned heavily against the elevator doors while Calvin pressed the button. "I have a car downstairs," Calvin said, watching the numbers tick down. "We'll get you to my place. I have a secure floor. Medical staff on call." "No," Rowan rasped. He opened his eyes, glaring at Calvin with a fierce, irrational stubbornness. "No doctors. No penthouses. I want to go home." "You're going into a severe drop, Rowan. You need a safe, sterile environment." "I need my own bed," Rowan snapped, his voice cracking. He wrapped his arms around himself, his teeth beginning to chatter violently despite the heat radiating from his skin. The temperature regulation in his body was completely breaking down. "I don't know you. You threw money at me like I was a dog. I am not going to your house so you can play savior." The elevator doors slid open with a metallic screech. Calvin felt the sting of the words, but he couldn't argue. He deserved the hostility. He guided Rowan into the metal box. The harsh lighting made Rowan look even worse. His skin was pale, clammy with cold sweat, and dark circles bruised the skin under his eyes. "Fine," Calvin said, pulling his phone from his pocket. "Give me your address." Rowan rattled off a street name in the South End, an area Calvin only knew from crime statistics and urban redevelopment proposals. Calvin texted his driver, Miller, instructing him to bring the car to the loading dock. When they emerged into the subterranean concrete garage, the freezing winter air hit them like a wall. Rowan let out a muffled whimper, his whole body violently shivering. A sleek black town car idled near the dumpsters. Miller, a stoic older alpha who had worked for Calvin for a decade, stepped out to open the rear door. As soon as Miller caught the scent rolling off Rowan, he froze, his hand tightening on the door handle. "Sir?" Miller asked, his voice tight, his eyes darting from Calvin to the trembling man in the filthy gray jumpsuit. "Turn the partition up, Miller. Lock the rear climate control to 75 degrees and drive to the address I sent you," Calvin ordered. He didn't offer an explanation. He helped Rowan slide onto the plush leather seats. Rowan instantly curled into a tight ball, pressing his face against his knees, trying to preserve his body heat. The leather was cold, squeaking softly under him. Calvin slid in next to him, leaving a wide foot of space between them. The heavy doors thudded shut, sealing them in the quiet, insulated cabin. The glass partition hummed as it slid up, separating them from the driver. "Take my coat," Calvin said. Rowan didn't move. "I'm dirty. I'll ruin it." "It's just wool." So Calvin shrugged out of his overcoat, a heavy charcoal cashmere blend, and draped it over Rowan's shaking shoulders. Rowan flinched at the weight, but as the fabric settled, engulfing him in Calvin's scent, the rich grounding aroma of dark tobacco and aged oak, a low, involuntary sound escaped his lips. It was a whine, a pathetic biological noise of comfort that he immediately tried to choke back. He grabbed the lapels of the coat, gripping the fabric so tightly his knuckles turned white, burying his nose into the collar. Calvin looked out the window, giving Rowan the dignity of pretending he hadn't heard the sound. The drive took 20 minutes. They crossed the invisible boundary line that separated the city's glittering core from its rotting edges. The smooth asphalt gave way to potholes that made the suspension of the expensive car work overtime. The towering glass facades were replaced by brick tenements, their fire escapes rusted, their windows barred. The car glided to a halt next to a curb littered with damp fast food wrappers and broken glass. A single street lamp flickered overhead, casting long, erratic shadows across the cracked sidewalk. Calvin stepped out into the freezing wind. He walked around to Rowan's side and opened the door. Rowan was practically catatonic. The heat had fully gripped him, sinking its claws into his nervous system. His eyes were glazed, half-lidded, and his breathing was a ragged, open-mouthed pant. He clutched Calvin's coat around himself like armor. "Can you walk?" Calvin asked. Rowan nodded weakly. He tried to slide out, but his legs were like wet noodles. Calvin caught him again, this time wrapping an arm firmly around Rowan's waist, anchoring the Omega against his side. "Third floor," Rowan mumbled, his face pressing against Calvin's shoulder. They walked into the building. The front door didn't even have a lock. The strike plate was missing entirely. The hallway smelled of stale cigarette smoke, boiling cabbage, and old, undisturbed dust. The fluorescent tube on the first floor was dead. They climbed the stairs in semi-darkness. Each step was a battle. Rowan dragged his feet, his breathing echoing loudly in the narrow, echoing stairwell. Calvin could feel the slick sweat soaking through Rowan's jumpsuit, transferring to his own ruined shirt. By the time they reached the third floor, Calvin was breathing hard. The sheer physical exertion of carrying dead weight up steep, uneven stairs in expensive dress shoes was taking its toll. Rowan fumbled in the pocket of his jumpsuit, producing a single brass key. He dropped it twice before Calvin gently took it from his trembling fingers and unlocked the heavy wooden door, labeled 3B in peeling black paint. The door swung open, revealing a space that was little more than a closet. Calvin stepped inside, guiding Rowan with him, and flipped the light switch. A bare bulb in the center of the ceiling illuminated the room. It was a studio apartment, cramped, oppressive, and freezing cold. The radiator beneath the single grime-caked window was silent. A mattress lay directly on the floor in the corner, covered in a chaotic pile of mismatched, thin blankets. A small kitchenette consisting of a mini fridge, a hot plate, and a rusted sink occupied the opposite wall. There was a cheap particle board dresser, one drawer missing entirely. It was stark. It was desperate. Calvin felt a sour twist in his gut. The $100 bill he had tossed onto the broken glass earlier would have bought this man groceries for a month. He had thrown it away without a second thought. Rowan pulled away from Calvin, stumbling blindly toward a narrow door near the kitchenette. He shoved it open, revealing a tiny bathroom, and slammed it shut behind him. The lock clicked loudly. A moment later, the sound of water running echoed through the thin walls. Calvin stood alone in the center of the room, the silence, broken only by the rattle of pipes and the distant wail of a police siren, felt heavy. He looked down at his own clothes. His expensive trousers were stained with gray mop water, his white shirt was damp with Rowan's sweat, and his shoes were ruined. He didn't care. He walked over to the radiator and placed his hand against the painted metal. Stone cold. He looked around for a thermostat, but there wasn't one. The building controlled the heat, and clearly the landlord didn't care if the tenants froze. The bathroom door creaked open. Rowan emerged. He had stripped off the filthy jumpsuit. He was wearing a pair of faded gray sweatpants that hung loose on his hips, and an old, threadbare t-shirt. His hair was damp, plastered to his forehead. He looked incredibly fragile, stripped of the heavy canvas uniform that usually hid his frame. He leaned against the door frame, his chest heaving. The cold shower hadn't broken the fever. If anything, the shock to his system seemed to have accelerated the biological drop. The scent of rosemary and rain was suffocating now, heavy with distress and a desperate, agonizing need. Rowan's dark eyes locked onto Calvin. The rational, angry man from the ballroom was gone, replaced by an Omega utterly consumed by his own biology. His body was screaming for an alpha. It was screaming for the specific alpha standing in his living room, radiating the dark tobacco scent that spelled safety, warmth, and relief. Rowan took a shaky step forward. His hands clenched into fists at his sides. He was fighting it. He was fighting millions of years of evolution with sheer, stubborn pride. "You should leave," Rowan said. His voice was barely a whisper, hoarse and ragged. "I'm not leaving you here to freeze," Calvin said, keeping his distance. He knew that taking even one step toward the Omega right now would be catastrophic. The biological pull was a magnetic force. If Calvin moved closer, his own instincts would take over, and he would smother the man. "I don't want you here," Rowan gritted out, a tear finally escaping, tracking down his flushed cheek. It wasn't a tear of sadness. It was a tear of pure physical frustration. I don't want this." "I know," Calvin said softly. "I know you don't. But you're sick, Rowan. Your body is crashing. You need an anchor." Rowan let out a bitter, ugly sob. He wrapped his arms around his waist, bending over slightly as a cramp hit him. I can't afford you. The words gutted Calvin. They were so raw, so violently honest. In Rowan's world, everything had a price. Help, comfort, even basic biology. It was all a transaction he couldn't afford to pay. Calvin slowly unbuttoned his damp dress shirt. He pulled it off, revealing a plain white undershirt beneath. He tossed the dress shirt onto the floor, then stripped off the undershirt. Rowan's breath hitched, his eyes tracking the movement. Calvin didn't step forward. He simply balled up the undershirt, heavy with his own pheromones and body heat, and tossed it gently across the room. It landed at Rowan's feet. You don't owe me anything, Calvin said, his voice dropping into a low, rumbling register designed by nature to soothe an agitated mate. I'm going to sit over by the door. I won't touch you, but take the shirt. Build your nest. Let your biology settle. Rowan stared at the crumpled white fabric on the scuffed floorboards. It was a lifeline. It was an indignity. Slowly, his legs shaking, Rowan dropped to his knees. He reached out and grabbed the shirt. He brought it to his face and inhaled deeply. The heavy, protective scent of dark tobacco washed over him, a narcotic hit straight to his brain. His rigid spine slumped. The fight drained out of him, replaced by a devastating, exhausting surrender. Rowan crawled to the mattress in the corner. He didn't walk. His legs had completely given out. He dragged himself over the cheap linoleum, clutching the white undershirt and Calvin's heavy cashmere overcoat. When he reached the bed, the nesting instinct took full control. It was a chaotic, frantic process. He grabbed the thin, scratchy blankets he owned and tore them off the mattress. He piled them up, rearranging them with jerky, uncoordinated movements. He placed Calvin's coat in the center, the soft wool forming the base, and buried his face in it. He wrapped the undershirt around his own neck, breathing in the scent over and over again. He curled into a tight fetal position in the center of the pathetic pile, pulling a ragged quilt over his head. Calvin watched from across the room. He slid down the wall next to the heavy wooden door, his back resting against the peeling paint. The floorboards were hard and cold through his damp trousers. He crossed his arms over his bare chest, resigning himself to the long night ahead. For the first hour, the room was filled with the terrible raw sounds of an unmedicated heat drop. Rowan whimpered, muffled cries of pain vibrating from beneath the quilt. He thrashed, kicking off the blankets, only to violently drag them back seconds later when the cold hit his feverish skin. The smell in the room was overwhelming. Rowan's distress spiked the air with a bitter, burnt edge to the rosemary, a smell that made Calvin's own chest ache with phantom pain. His alpha biology screamed at him to cross the room, to pull the suffering man into his arms, to bite the nape of his neck and flood his system with claiming pheromones that would chemically neutralize the pain. It took every ounce of Calvin's formidable willpower to stay glued to the floor. Rowan had explicitly said no. He didn't want this. He didn't want Calvin. Forcing biological comfort on a man who despised him was a violation Calvin would not commit, no matter how loudly his instincts roared. Instead, Calvin started talking. He didn't know what to say, so he just spoke. He kept his voice low, steady, and rumbling, a continuous vibrating anchor of sound. The architecture of this building is pre-war, Calvin murmured to the empty room, his eyes fixed on the lump under the blankets. Probably built in the 20s. The masonry on the exterior is solid, but they gutted the interiors in the 70s. Cheap drywall, terrible insulation. Rowan whimpered, a long, drawn-out sound. I bought a building like this 5 years ago in the West End, Calvin continued, forcing himself to drone on, keeping his tone monotonous and soothing. The board wanted to level it, turn it into a glass tower. I fought them. We retrofitted the plumbing, restored the original brick. It cost a fortune. My CFO stopped talking to me for a month. He talked for hours. He talked about quarterly earnings reports, the intricacies of supply chain logistics, the boring, mind-numbing reality of sitting in a boardroom listening to men in expensive suits argue over profit margins. He talked until his throat was dry and his voice cracked. Around 4 a.m., the thrashing finally stopped. The bitter, burnt edge to Rowan's scent began to fade, slowly replaced by a heavy, exhausted dampness. The sharp spikes of pain had passed, leaving behind the dull, lethargic ache of a settled fever. Calvin stopped talking. He rested his head against the wall, staring at the ceiling. His back was agonizingly stiff, his bare chest freezing in the unheated room. Outside, the sky slowly began to turn a bruised, ugly gray. The city was waking up. A garbage truck rumbled down the street, its hydraulic brakes hissing loudly. On the mattress, the pile of blankets shifted. Rowan pushed the quilt down. His face was flushed, his lips dry and cracked, but his eyes were clear. The frantic, glazed look of the biological drop was gone. He looked exhausted, hollowed out, but lucid. He stared across the room at Calvin. Calvin was a mess. The billionaire looked like he had been dragged behind a car. He was sitting on the dirty floor, shirtless, his expensive trousers ruined, dark shadows under his eyes. Rowan sat up slowly, wincing as his stiff muscles protested. He looked down at his own hands. He was clutching Calvin's white undershirt so tightly his fingers ached. He loosened his grip, letting the fabric drop into his lap. He looked back at Calvin. The heavy silence stretched between them, utterly devoid of the hostile tension from the ballroom. It was just quiet. "You stayed," Rowan said. His voice was gravel, ruined from a night of muffled screaming. "I told you I would," Calvin replied, his voice equally rough. He didn't move from his spot by the door. Rowan rubbed his eyes with the heels of his hands, a tired, defeated gesture. He looked around his dismal, freezing apartment, then at the man sitting on his floor. The sheer inequity of it all was absurd. "My radiator's broken," Rowan muttered, a sudden incongruous statement in the heavy atmosphere. "I noticed," Calvin said dryly. "The landlord says the boiler's fine. He says I'm just leaving the window open." Rowan stared at the rusted metal box under the window. "He's a liar." Calvin slowly pushed himself up from the floor. His joints popped loudly in the quiet room. He walked over to the window, placed his hand on the icy metal of the radiator, and then turned to look at Rowan. "I know a few things about bad landlords," Calvin said quietly. "Do you have any coffee?" Rowan let out a short, breathy scoff that lacked any real venom. "I have instant, and tap water, assuming the pipes haven't frozen." "I'll take it." Calvin walked over to the pathetic kitchenette. He picked up the cheap plastic kettle sitting on the counter and turned on the tap. The water sputtered, then flowed, a cloudy stream into the plastic jug. Rowan watched him from the nest of blankets. He watched the broad expanse of Calvin's back, the way the muscles moved as he navigated the tiny space. His biology was calm now, heavily sedated by the sheer volume of Calvin's scent embedded in the blankets. But his mind was racing. He had hated this man 12 hours ago. He had wanted nothing more than to scrub his floors, take his meager paycheck, and remain invisible. Now, the billionaire was making him cheap instant coffee in a freezing tenement apartment, having sat on the floor all night just to talk him through a fever dream. Calvin turned around, holding 2 chipped ceramic mugs. He walked over and held one out. Rowan hesitated. He looked at the mug, then at Calvin's face. The arrogance was gone. The corporate mask was gone. There was just a tired man offering a hot drink. Slowly, Rowan reached out and took the mug. Their fingers brushed. There was no electric shock this time, no biological panic, just the steady, solid warmth of another human being. "Thanks," Rowan murmured, wrapping his cold hands around the ceramic. "Drink it," Calvin said, stepping back to give him space. "Then we need to figure out how to get your heat turned back on before nightfall." Rowan stared into the murky brown liquid. The instant coffee tasted like burnt copper and dust, leaving a gritty film on the roof of his mouth. It was a pathetic offering for a man who probably drank beans harvested by monks on a private island, but Calvin swallowed it without a single flinch. He drank it like it was water, his throat working in the dim light of the bare bulb overhead. Daylight was bleeding through the grime-frosted window, turning the shadows in the small room a sickly, bruised purple. The harsh reality of morning stripped away the heavy, instinct-driven intimacy of the night. Rowan was acutely aware of how small the space was. He could hear the couple in 4B arguing over a misplaced set of car keys. He could smell the rancid frying oil wafting up from the first-floor diner through the floorboards. And in the middle of all this cheap, grinding poverty sat an alpha worth billions, half naked on a stained linoleum floor. "My shift manager," Rowan said, breaking the silence. His voice still sounded like torn sandpaper. He kept his eyes locked on the cracked rim of his mug. "His name is Greg. He's going to dock me for abandoning the site. Probably fire me. The contracting company has a zero-tolerance policy for walking off a job, especially a high-tier venue like yours." Calvin lowered his mug. He didn't look angry, just deeply, quietly calculating. "I told you last night. I will handle it." "How?" Rowan snapped, the spike of defensive adrenaline making his hands shake, sloshing the hot coffee over his knuckles. He barely felt the burn. "You're going to call a mid-level shift manager at a commercial cleaning firm and tell him not to fire the guy who ruined your suit and bailed on his zone? He'll think I put you up to it. He'll think I'm trying to extort you. You don't understand how these people work. They fire first to avoid the liability." "Rowan," Calvin's voice was low, laced with a subtle, anchoring frequency that immediately made the hair on Rowan's arm stand up. "I am not going to call your shift manager. I am going to call the CEO of the contracting firm. By 10 o'clock, he will personally ensure your employment file is locked, and your wages for the next month are paid in full as a gesture of goodwill for his staff being subjected to an unsafe working environment." Rowan felt a cold twist in his gut. It wasn't relief. It was vertigo. "You can't do that," Rowan whispered. "I can," Calvin replied simply. "And I will." "No." Rowan set his mug down on the cheap particle board dresser. It landed with a dull thud. "No, you don't get to do that. You don't get to wave a magic wand and rewrite my life just because you feel guilty about throwing $100 at me." Calvin frowned, the muscles in his jaw ticking. He set his own mug down on the floor. "This isn't about guilt. You are recovering from a severe heat drop without proper medical suppression. You are physically vulnerable. My biology, my basic human decency, will not allow me to walk out of this building leaving you to get fired by some middle management tyrant." "So you're going to buy my boss?" Rowan let out a harsh, broken laugh, dragging a hand through his damp hair. The lingering scent of Calvin's undershirt clung to his skin, a constant, humiliating reminder of how deeply his body had surrendered a few hours ago. What happens next week? What happens when you go back to your penthouse and I'm still here, but now I'm the freak whose job was saved by a billionaire? They'll hate me. They'll find another reason to push me out. You fix things from the top down, Calvin. Down here on the ground, your kind of help just puts a target on my back. Calvin stared at him. The absolute certainty in Rowan's voice was a language Calvin didn't speak. In Calvin's world, power was absolute. If a problem arose, you buried it in capital. You bought the threat. You acquired the obstacle. He looked at Rowan, really looked at him. The Omega was shivering again, a secondary chill settling deep into his bones as the fever finally broke completely. He looked small, wrapped in the thin, ragged quilt, his collarbones jutting out sharply against the stretched collar of his faded t-shirt. But his eyes were dark, furious, and entirely unbowed. He wasn't a problem to be acquired. "Then what do you want me to do?" Calvin asked, the question feeling heavy, foreign on his tongue. He was a man who gave orders, who dictated terms. Asking an exhausted, underpaid cleaner for direction felt like stepping off a cliff in the dark. "I want you to leave," Rowan said. The words hurt to say. His traitorous biology practically screamed in protest, demanding he drag the alpha back into the pathetic nest of blankets. He ignored it, forcing his spine straight. Your driver is probably still circling the block. Put your shirt back on. Go home. I'll call Greg and tell him I got sick. Maybe he suspends me. Maybe he fires me. But it'll be my mess. I know how to clean up my own messes. Calvin didn't move. He sat cross-legged on the floor, the early morning light catching the faint dusting of dark hair on his chest. He looked down at his ruined dress shoes, the leather warped and stained white from the chemical salts in the mop water. I can't leave, Calvin said, his tone devoid of its usual command. It sounded almost like a confession. You have to, Rowan insisted, his voice rising, panic bleeding into his scent. The sharp, bitter tang of crushed rosemary filled the tiny room, pushing back against the lingering warmth of Calvin's tobacco. You don't belong here. Look at you. You look like a hostage. This isn't a charity mission. I know it's not, Calvin said, raising his head. His dark eyes locked onto Rowan's, pinning him in place. I'm not here because I pity you. I'm here because... Calvin stopped, struggling with the words. He was a master of corporate negotiation, but this required a vulnerability he hadn't practiced in decades. Because my scent triggered your drop. Because I ignored you when you were hurting. And because... He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. The heavy magnetic pull between them was undeniable, a thick, invisible cord stretching across the 6 feet of cheap linoleum. It was the raw, unpolished biological compatibility that had forced Calvin to his knees in the ballroom puddle. Rowan swallowed hard, his throat clicking. Biology is just a chemical reaction. It doesn't mean anything. It doesn't pay the rent. Speaking of rent, Calvin said, shifting gears so fast it gave Rowan whiplash. He reached into the pocket of his ruined trousers and pulled out his phone. The screen was cracked, probably from carrying Rowan up the stairs, but it lit up instantly. Who is your landlord? Don't do this, Rowan warned, pushing the quilt off and throwing his legs over the side of the mattress. His muscles screamed in protest, a dull, throbbing ache radiating from his lower back, but he forced himself to stand. He wobbled slightly, catching himself on the edge of the dresser. I mean it. Put the phone away. Calvin ignored him. He tapped the screen. Miller, run a property search on this address. I want the holding company, the registered agent, and a direct line to the managing owner. 5 minutes. He ended the call and tossed the phone onto the kitchenette counter. You arrogant son of a bitch, Rowan breathed out, his hands clenching into fists. The fear was gone, replaced entirely by a hot, bright anger. You just don't listen. You hear words, but you don't actually listen. I am listening to you shiver, Calvin countered, his own voice rising, the alpha edge bleeding back in. He stood up, towering over Rowan in the cramped space. He didn't step closer, keeping the boundary intact, but his presence filled the room like a physical weight. I'm looking at a radiator that hasn't worked in a month. I'm looking at a man who nearly worked himself into a coma because he couldn't afford sick leave. You want to talk about pride? Pride is for people who aren't freezing to death in their own homes. It's my home, Rowan shouted, the sound raw and echoing in the small box of the apartment. It's a dump. It's freezing, and it smells like garbage, but it is mine. I pay for it. I scrub the vomit of people like you off marble floors to pay for it. You don't get to waltz in here, throw your black card around, and play God. I am trying to keep you warm. Eerie, Calvin yelled back, the frustration finally cracking his stoic facade. I don't want your warmth if it comes with a leash. The silence that followed was deafening. The echoes of their shouting seemed to bounce off the peeling wallpaper, settling into the dust. Rowan stood by the dresser, his chest heaving, his pale face flushed with exertion and anger. The scent in the room was chaotic. A battlefield of burnt herbs, distressed ozone, sharp oak, and the heavy defensive musk of an alpha pushed to the edge. Calvin stared at him, the word leash ringing in his ears. He looked at his phone sitting on the counter. He looked at the thin, trembling man standing across from him. Rowan wasn't a competitor to be crushed or a subordinate to be managed. He was a man fighting for his dignity in a world that stripped it from him every single day. Calvin slowly exhaled, a long, ragged breath that seemed to deflate his broad shoulders. He ran a hand over his face, feeling the rough stubble on his jaw. "You're right," Calvin said softly. Rowan blinked, momentarily derailed by the sudden surrender. "What?" "You're right. I'm treating you like a logistical problem." Calvin walked over to the counter and picked up his phone. He didn't look at the screen. He just held it in his hand. "I don't know how to do this. I don't know how to be in a room with a problem I'm not allowed to solve." "Not everything is a problem," Rowan muttered, crossing his arms tightly over his chest, shivering violently as another wave of post-fever chills hit him. "Some things are just life. You survive them. You don't buy your way out." Suddenly, a heavy rhythmic pounding echoed through the thin wooden door. "Rowan, I know you're in there!" A raspy, aggressive voice yelled from the hallway. "Rent was due Tuesday. I ain't running a charity ward." Rowan froze. The blood drained from his face, leaving him ashen. It was Anthony, the building manager, the man who controlled the heat, the locks, and the constant threat of eviction. "I have it," Rowan called out, his voice instantly losing its fierce edge, dropping into the placating, anxious tone of a tenant cornered by his landlord. He scrambled toward the dresser, pulling open the top drawer. It stuck halfway, screeching loudly. "Just give me a second, Anthony." Calvin watched as Rowan frantically dug through a pile of folded socks and cheap t-shirts, pulling out a battered envelope. Rowan's hands were shaking so badly he dropped it. Thin, worn bills spilled out onto the floor. 20s, 10s, 5s. Tip money from side jobs scraped together and carefully hoarded. The pounding on the door resumed, harder this time. "Open the damn door, Rowan, or I'm using the master key. I smell that weird weed smell you've got going on in there. You're stinking up the whole floor." He was smelling Rowan's distressed pheromones. Calvin's vision tinted red. The protective instincts he had been wrestling with all night snapped off their leash. Before Rowan could gather the scattered bills, Calvin crossed the room in 2 massive strides. He didn't even bother putting his shirt on. He grabbed the brass doorknob, twisted it violently, and yanked the heavy door open. Anthony stood in the hallway, a heavy-set alpha in his late 50s with a stained undershirt and a lit cigarette hanging from his bottom lip. He had his master key in his hand, ready to force entry. When the door flew open, Anthony took a step forward. His mouth opened to shout. He stopped dead. Calvin filled the doorway. He was half naked, his expensive trousers ruined, but the sheer, overwhelming force of his alpha presence hit Anthony like a physical wall. Calvin didn't say a word. He didn't have to. He just stared down at the landlord, his dark eyes utterly flat, devoid of any human warmth. The scent rolling off Calvin was no longer the soothing tobacco of a caretaker. It was the sharp, metallic ozone of a dominant alpha defending a claim. Anthony swallowed, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously. The cigarette ash fell from his lip onto his stained shirt. He took a hasty step backward, his own weak pheromones instantly souring with fear. Anthony stammered, his eyes darting from Calvin's broad chest to the dark interior of the apartment, looking for Rowan. "I was just... rent collection. Standard procedure." "The radiator in this unit is broken," Calvin said. His voice was a low, terrifying rumble that vibrated through the floorboards. It was the voice of a man accustomed to destroying careers with a single sentence. "It's an old building, buddy." Anthony tried to rally, attempting a weak, placating smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Boiler's finicky. Needs a part. Takes time." "It takes exactly 10 minutes, Calvin replied, stepping out of the doorway, forcing Anthony to retreat further into the dim hallway. "You will go down to the basement right now. You will bleed the valve, check the pressure, and turn the heat on for the entire 3rd floor. If this radiator is not hot to the touch by the time I finish my coffee, I will have my legal team file a gross negligence suit that will freeze your bank accounts, seize this property, and ensure you spend the rest of your life answering to a court-appointed trustee. Do you understand?" Anthony was pale, sweat beading on his forehead. He wasn't looking at a tenant's guest. He knew with absolute certainty he was looking at a predator that could swallow him whole. "Yes, sir," Anthony mumbled, his voice tight. "Right away. Going right now." He turned and practically jogged down the hallway, his heavy boots thudding rapidly against the worn floorboards until the sound faded down the stairwell. Calvin stood in the doorway for a long moment, waiting until the scent of Anthony's fear dissipated completely. He took a slow, deep breath, reining in his dominant pheromones, forcing his biology back into a state of calm. It took effort. He turned back into the apartment and quietly closed the door. Rowan was still sitting on the floor by the dresser, clutching a fistful of $5 bills. He was staring at Calvin, his eyes wide, his breathing shallow. Calvin didn't look triumphant. He looked deeply, profoundly tired. He walked over to where his ruined undershirt still lay near the mattress. He picked it up, shook out the dust, and pulled it over his head. The fabric was cold and stiff, but it covered him. He felt exposed, stripped of his usual armor. He walked back to the spot by the door, slid down the wall, and sat on the floor exactly where he had spent the night. He pulled his knees up, resting his forearms on them, and looked across the room at Rowan. "I didn't buy the building," Calvin said quietly. "I didn't call your boss. I just yelled at the guy who controls the thermostat." Rowan slowly lowered his hands. He looked at the crumpled money in his lap, then at the heavy wooden door, and finally at the billionaire sitting on his cheap linoleum floor. The anger that had been boiling in Rowan's chest slowly began to simmer down, replaced by a strange, hollow ache. He had expected Calvin to pull out his phone, make the call, and obliterate Anthony with capital. He had expected the billionaire to prove, once again, that money was the only language he spoke, but Calvin hadn't done that. He had used his own presence. He had stepped into the hallway, into the dirt and the grime of Rowan's reality, and fought the battle on Rowan's turf. He had defended the space without trying to purchase it. "You threatened him with a legal team," Rowan pointed out, his voice raspy, lacking its previous venom. "Old habits," Calvin admitted, a self-deprecating half-smile pulling at the corner of his mouth. "I can go back out there and offer to fight him in the alley if you prefer a more traditional approach." A sudden, unexpected snort of laughter escaped Rowan's lips. It was an ugly sound, rusty and choked, but it was genuine. He pressed a hand over his mouth, his shoulders shaking slightly. The sheer absurdity of the image, a billionaire in ruined tailored trousers throwing fists behind a dumpster in the South End, broke the tension. Calvin watched him laugh, the tension leaving his own shoulders. The air in the room felt different now. The heavy warring scents of burnt rosemary and defensive ozone were gone. What remained was something softer, quieter, a subtle, grounding blend of damp earth after a storm, wrapped in the warmth of aged oak. Rowan gathered the bills from the floor, placing them carefully back into the envelope. He stood up, his legs steadier this time, and walked over to the mattress. He didn't climb under the covers. Instead, he pulled the heavy cashmere overcoat out from the center of the nest. He walked across the small room and stopped in front of Calvin. Calvin looked up. Rowan held out the coat. "You're going to freeze on the way to the car," Rowan said softly. Calvin looked at the coat. It was covered in lint, reeked of cheap laundry detergent and instant coffee, and held the deep embedded scent of Rowan's distress and subsequent comfort. It was ruined. Calvin reached out and took the coat. He didn't put it on. He simply held it in his lap. "Thank you," Calvin said. From beneath the window, a loud metallic clank echoed in the room, then another. A slow, steady hissing sound began to fill the space. Rowan turned his head. The radiator. He walked over to it and hovered his hand inches from the peeling paint. He could feel the faint initial wave of heat pushing through the cold iron. Anthony had actually gone to the basement. Rowan closed his eyes, a profound wave of exhaustion washing over him. The heat drop was over. The crisis had passed. He was tired. His body felt like bruised fruit, and his apartment was still a miserable box in a bad neighborhood. Nothing had magically changed. He was still broke. He still had to figure out how to salvage his job on Monday. But as he stood there, feeling the slow, mechanical warmth of the radiator fighting back the freezing air, he realized he didn't feel quite as empty. He turned back to look at Calvin. The alpha was still sitting by the door, watching him with an expression of patient, quiet intensity. He wasn't leaving. He wasn't pushing. He was simply waiting to see what Rowan would do next. "The water from the tap takes about 10 minutes to get hot," Rowan said, his voice barely above a whisper in the quiet room. "If you want to wash the rest of the floor water off your face." Calvin didn't smile, but something in his dark eyes shifted, a subtle, profound relief settling into his rigid posture. He didn't offer to buy a new water heater. He didn't offer a hotel room. 10 minutes, Calvin repeated softly. He slowly pushed himself up from the floor, using the wall for leverage. He stood tall, the ruined undershirt clinging to his broad chest, and walked toward the tiny bathroom. He stopped at the threshold and looked back. "I can wait." "Tew!" Rowan watched him disappear into the cramped space. The sound of the rusted tap squeaking open filled the room, followed by the erratic rush of water. Rowan walked back to the mattress. He sat on the edge, the thin springs groaning beneath him. He looked at the envelope of tip money on the dresser. He looked at the steaming mug of instant coffee. He inhaled the scent of the room, a quiet, imperfect blend of his own survival and Calvin's stubborn, grounding presence. It wasn't a fairy tale. It wasn't a rescue. It was just a cold morning in a broken apartment. But for the first time in his life, Rowan didn't feel like he had to clean up the mess all by himself. He reached for the coffee mug, the ceramic finally warming his cracked hands, and took a slow, quiet sip, listening to the radiator hum to life against the frozen window. The raw reality of two totally different worlds colliding proves that sometimes the deepest connections are forged not in ballrooms, but on cold linoleum floors. If Rowan and Calvin's gritty, imperfect journey moved you, please hit that like button. Share this video with anyone who loves grounded, realistic Omegaverse dramas that ditch the cliches for real human emotion. Don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss out on these intense audio stories. Tell me in the comments, do you think Calvin can truly adapt to Rowan's world? See you in the next one.